Okay, so we don't have any out of towners. That's. Oh, I'm sorry. I didn't see anybody. Where are y'all from? Okay, we're glad to have you here. Okay, I'm Ron Hudson. I've pretty much lived here my whole life, uh, except for going off to school, which wasn't that off. I went to University of Alabama, undergrad and law school. Uh, my wife is from here, so we have both pretty much spent our entire lives here. My memories go back probably, I was trying to remember some of my earliest memories. I guess my earliest memories would go back to about around 1950. That I can actually remember particular incidents and where they took place, you know. So that's been a while. But anyway, I just wanted to come down here because we're overlooking, of course, the park and the spring and everything. What we know is somewhere between 1815 and 1817. Now, I don't know why it's not 100% documented, but somewhere in that time frame, this area was settled for the first time by, I'm talking about a settlement, not people being here, in and out and that type of thing, but was settled for the first time by white settlers. At that particular time in history, this area was occupied by the Chickasaw Nation. And you've heard, you know, of course, we're Colbert County. Colbert County is named for the George and Levi Colbert, who were both Chickasaw, I guess you could say, chiefs. And in fact, Tuscumbia is named for Chickasaw chief at the time the first white settlers came here. His name has been, it's been said that his actual pronunciation of his name, and I'm not saying this is correct, I'm saying this is what has been told, was Tuscumbia or Tuscumbia. Now, since none of us were around back then, all we know is that's what we're told. That's the understanding. But it became eventually Tuscumbia. Now, somewhere, as I said, between 1815 and 1817, Michael Dixon came here by way of his flatboat with his family. They came from Tennessee, down the Tennessee River, and then came up area now is called Spring Creek, brought the creek and came on in where the spring originates. We know for certain that there was a settlement here in 1817 because that's when the military road was being constructed by United States soldiers. This was right after the War of 1812 had ended. Andrew Jackson, of course, gained his fame during that period, both with regard to the Creek Indian War and the War of 1812, specifically because of the Battle of New Orleans, which is ironic. The Battle of New Orleans actually took place after the treaty had been signed between England and the United States over in Belgium. But you know, back then you didn't have quick communications, and the news of that treaty being signed had to travel by ship from Europe to the United States. So anyway, by the time that information arrived in the United States, the Battle of New Orleans had already been fought. United States troops had been victorious, and you might say Andrew Jackson's whole reputation had gone to the top because of that, being the commanding officer of that battle. Anyway, when they began to construct the military road, which was to run from New Orleans to Nashville, as an alternate to the Natchez Trace, which was the older road that went down through the wilderness west of here. He felt like there needed to be a much better way to make that connection. So the military road was constructed in 1817. And there are journals and diaries and so forth by the soldiers involved in the construction of the military road about a settlement in this location. Now, it was not named at that time, and it had no name, but the information that was written down by these soldiers said they were both commercial and residential structures here. So we know that that was really the beginning of what was to become Tuscumbia. And just real quickly, and then we'll get started. Finally, in 1820, the settlement was incorporated as Coldwater, or in the Chickasaw dialect, Ococopos, meaning Coldwater. 1821, it was incorporated as Big Spring. And then finally in 1822, it's kind of like, what's going on here? Why can't they make up their mind? 1822, it was determined that it be named Tuscumbia in honor of the, as I said a while ago, the Chickasaw chief, Tuscumbia, who would have been here when the Dixon family arrived. You see right away that Tuscumbia, what we now know as Tuscumbia, was here as an early settlement before statehood. Alabama became a state in 1819. Prior to that, it had been part of the Mississippi Territory. Mississippi had become a state in 1817, and then Alabama in 1819. But of course, as I said, what was to become Tuscumbia was already here. So many of the buildings, the older buildings that we'll see, and I'll try to mention the ones that I can take special note of, were built, buildings that are still here today were built as early as the 1820s. Well, let's start heading back the way we came. I want to just briefly mention the building on the corner there. That was built in the 1820s. That was built in the 1820s, and it was built by the Sutherland family, and it was, of course, a commercial building, and I think it was originally just known as Sutherland's Store. Again, as far as we know, from what information we've been able to figure out, it is the oldest commercial building that's still standing in the state of Alabama, built in the 1820s. Because you got to stop and think, most anything built that far back isn't around anymore, you know, especially in a downtown area where you're going to be having renovation and modernization and all that sort of thing down through the years. And went to Texas. And one of the Sutherland sons was at the Alamo in Texas during the Battle of the Alamo, or I think he actually was sent for reinforcements and was able to get out of there right before the battle started, which was good fortune for him. Of course, that was in 1836. For quite a while and was uncovered a number of years ago. But as you can see, this says Bijou, and this was the location of possibly the first movie theater in Tuscumbia, and it was a silent movie theater. I don't recall the exact date, but it was probably, sound developed in the movies in the mid-1920s. They were called talkies, because all of a sudden you could hear the actors talk. So, but anyway, this was the old silent movie house, the Bijou. Now, right across the street, this big structure that's joined now to the one on the corner, but the big structure that goes up pretty high. That was originally the Tuscumbian Theater, and it opened in 1950. It was completed and opened in 1950, and I do have a vague recollection as a small child of workers being up on that roof. I guess they were putting the finishing touches on everything. But there was already another movie theater here at the time that was up in the next block, about midway, called the Strand Theater. Tuscumbian was state of the art, and there was a period where they both continued to run. The Strand continued to run, and the Tuscumbian both. Now, when I was a kid, again, a little fella, when you got old enough to go to the movie with your friends, not have to go with mom and daddy, we would go to the Strand on Saturday. And you always had the old double feature and the cereals and cartoons. You could stay there all day, you know. I guess that was the purpose of it, babysitter. But anyway, there was a period where they both continued to run, and they eventually closed the Strand, and that just left the Tuscumbia. Now, also, you got to remember, in the period I'm talking about, we were still segregated, and there was a separate, the main entrance was right there where the glassed-in area is now, with the mural on it, and then there was a separate entrance around on this side for the black folks. And I'll have to say, growing up during that period of time, I mean, you know, I didn't know the difference. That's just the way it was. I guess some people's social conscience develops sooner than others, and all I was interested in at that age was having a good time with my friends and so on and so forth. I wasn't too much into what was going on in the world around me. But that was the case for a number of years. The mid-'60s, all that changed. And while we're mentioning that, same thing with the schools. You know, the landmark Supreme Court case was Brown versus Board of Education that came down in 1954 that said separate but equal isn't going to get it. You know, that's not true. And so it was ruled at that time that there was going to have to be integration. Now, here in this part of the country, it didn't happen until 1965. So you got an 11-year period there that everyone knew it was coming, but you didn't know exactly when. In the fall of 1965, black schools here, Sheffield, Florence, began to phase out. But it was done over a period of time. It wasn't done all at once. The best I recall, it was done over about a 2-year period primarily, maybe over into 3 years. But that's the way it happened. I had just gotten out of high school and was in college at that time. But just fall of '65 was when the schools began to integrate. Okay, that's the Palace building, Palace Drugstore. That originally, that's a pre-Civil War structure and was originally used as a hotel. And here's where I guess we need to start talking about the railroad. Tuscumbia had the first railroad west of the Allegheny Mountain, part of the Appalachian chain. There were just a few railroads in the country at that time, very few, and they were all to the east. Because you got to remember, when you go back to the 1820s and 30s, pretty much everything west of the Alleghenies was frontier. We think of the frontier as being on out past the Mississippi. What was considered the frontier after the Civil War was over with. And they began to start settling further west. So Tuscumbia would have actually been part of the frontier. at that time. And the first railroad, the beginnings of the railroad started because they needed an easier and quicker way to get goods from the river that were coming in by steamboat from all over everywhere. They needed a way to get those goods into town. These buildings going down to the west there are called Commercial Road. And there again, these are supposedly the oldest commercial buildings that are still intact all together in the state. That is called Commercial Road. And what they did, they had a rail line run from the river into Tuscumbia and up to this point to unload the goods that were coming in. It was originally a horse-drawn train. I don't know if you didn't really call it a train, but it was not a motorized or mechanized engine of any kind. And what wound up happening, eventually the rail line was extended and went on up 5th Street. And when you get up where 5th and Water Street connect, it veered to the right. And initially went to Cortland, Alabama. Then it was eventually extended from Cortland to Decatur. And then from Decatur to Huntsville. All this was over a period of time. And during that period of time, of course, they got the first steam engine, where it really made it practical to utilize the rails. From Huntsville, it became part of what was then, this is pre-Civil War, but what was then the main east-west rail line, which was the Memphis to Charleston, ran west to east from Memphis to Charleston, became part of that rail line, which eventually, later, became the Southern Railway, which now is the Norfolk Southern Railway. So anyway, that's a brief history of the rail line. And that train ran up 5th Street and back over to the right, like I said, where 5th and Water connect, until after World War II. And that's when the lines were finally rerouted and they quit having the train coming right up through the middle of town, But with the advent of the railroad, you had to have hotels. We've mentioned the Palace had been a hotel at one time. Down at the far end of that block, those of you that are familiar with the area where the cleaners used to be, was the Franklin House Hotel. And it was about a 4-story hotel. I mean, it was a big one, especially for that day. And then this structure over here originally had another level. It burned many, many years ago, but that was the Planter Hotel. It had some other names also, but so you had all these hotels, and the reason they're where they are is because the rail line ran right up through here. There's a good side to all this and a downside, because once you begin to start attracting people from everywhere coming through here on the rails, obviously you got some good folks and some not so good folks. So Tuscumbia became, it's always been. I know the motto is Tuscumbia, the friendly city, and all that. It's just a nice little quaint Victorian era town, but it was pretty rough. It was pretty rough for a period there. There was just put it bluntly, there was a lot of vice and corruption that existed here. At one time, a few I was talking about a while ago, there was one of these buildings down here, I can't remember which, you could go down into the basement, and there was a tunnel that ran down to the basement of the Franklin House Hotel. And that's where anything you could think of vice-wise went on, and the good, respectable citizens of Tuscumbia that did not want to be seen entering the Franklin house would come in and go down the tunnel and get there that way where nobody saw them, And I didn't know that for a long time, but, they finally closed that tunnel off. But I've been told that when they did, and when they got down to the basement of what had been the Franklin house, there was still all kind of gambling equipment and paraphernalia down there. So I don't know what happened to all that. But obviously they closed that off, and that was the end of that. One more thing, and then we'll start moving again. In 1890, we had I guess what you'd say instead of famous, an infamous shootout right here in downtown Tuscumbia. And it was not by the dregs of society, it was by prominent individuals. The mayor of Tuscumbia at that time was John Anthony Steele, Jr. His father had been one of the very early probate judges when Colbert County was formed from the northern half of Franklin County. We were all part of Franklin until after the Civil War. And then they took essentially the northern half of Franklin and made Colbert from that. John Anthony Steele Sr. was one of the early probate judges. He had been one of the delegates from, at the time, Franklin County to the state secession convention in Montgomery in January of 1861. Anyway, the Steele family, John Anthony Steele Sr. that we were just talking about, had married one of William Winston's daughters, the Winston home up on the Dexter campus. William Winston was a brother to Isaac Winston that owned the Belmont plantation south of town. And William Winston came here from Huntsville. He had a son, John Anthony Winston, who was one of Alabama's pre-Civil War governors. But William Winston came here, and one of his daughters married John Anthony Steele Sr. Another of his daughters married Robert Burns Lindsay, who was Alabama's only foreign-born governor. He was governor shortly after the Civil War, and he was a native of Scotland. But anyway, and his house is right up here on Main Street at the corner of Main and First Street. There's a marker there. So, as I said, the Steele family, the Winston family were all tied in together, and they were all prominent people. Well, John Anthony Steele Sr. had several sons. John Anthony Jr., as I said, was the mayor at that time. And they had the youngest brother in the family was named Metcalf Steele. Everybody called him Met Steele. He was probably, at the time all this happened, maybe a teenager. And in 1890, I tell people, everybody knows about the gunfight at the OK Corral out in Tombstone, Arizona. Well, that happened in 81. This was 9 years later, 1890, here in Tuscumbia, which was a very similar situation. But anyway, there was a family here named Challen, Challen. Mr. Challen was the local undertaker. We don't know exactly what happened, but apparently Met Steele, the younger brother, the youngest of the Steele brothers, somehow offended her. Now, in 1890, it might not have taken a whole lot to be considered offending somebody. He might have whistled at her or something. I mean, I don't know. And we don't know. I mean, there's never been anything said definitely about what happened, but he offended her. She told her husband. Her husband went and got his good friend, Mr. Goodwin, and they approached John Anthony Steele Sr. about what had happened, seeking satisfaction. And I think he, in so many words, just said, "Get out of here," or something like that. In other words, they didn't get any satisfaction at all from him. So, as you might figure, they came downtown looking for John Anthony Steele Jr. And he was with his brother at the time, one of the other older brothers named Tom Steele. And they came down and started looking for them. Well, I guess it wasn't that unusual back in those days for everybody to be packing, wasn't unusual to have a weapon on. And so they finally ran into one another. And we've never been able to specify the exact location, but somewhere right here in downtown Tuscumbia, there was a store that was called, it would have been a drugstore, but back then they were called apothecaries. And it was Abernathy's Apothecary. They met up in there, words were exchanged, and before you knew it, the guns came out. John Anthony Steele Jr. was immediately shot in the head and killed. He was only in his 30s. Tom Steele returned fire and hit Mr. Goodwin and very grievously wounded him, but didn't kill him. And then finally cooler heads prevailed and it got broken up. Even Tracy Abernathy, who owned the store, Abernathy's Apothecary, was hit, but not seriously. I mean, thankfully it wasn't, he just was in the way, got caught in the crossfire. Anyway, they got everything broken up. As I said, the mayor, John Anthony Jr., was killed, and Mr. Goodwin was very badly wounded, and it took him about 2 years to fully recuperate. I don't know that he fully recuperated, but to recuperate sufficient to be able to get around and so forth. Well, all this time, and since it was a mutual, what we would refer to as a mutual affray, everything happened all at once, and they were all shooting at each other. So there was never anybody charged or any kind of case made. They just let it go. Well, while Mr. Goodwin was recuperating, Tom Steele was biding his time and making plans for what was going to happen when Mr. Goodwin got back to where he could be out and about in Tuscumbia. In 1892, Mr. Goodwin had gone down to the Franklin house. Tom Steele found out that's where he was. And next door to the Franklin house was a saloon. So Tom Steele just stepped inside the saloon. He had a shotgun with him. And he waited, knowing that Mr. Goodwin, when he came out of the Franklin house, he would be coming back up this way toward Main Street and would have to pass the saloon. So he just stood there and waited until that happened. And once Mr. Goodwin came by, he just stepped out with the shotgun and unloaded on him. Didn't kill him. And he staggered out into the street. It would have been down in near that next intersection, Water Street and 5th. He staggered out into the street and collapsed. While he was lying there, I don't know whether that would have been a mortal wound or not, but while he was lying there still alive, Tom Steele walked over to him and took a pistol and finished him off right there in the street in front of everybody. Well, it turned out, again, these being influential families, they had a relative, the Winston family had a relative who had been here and had practiced law here earlier, and you'll recognize the name. His mother had been a Winston, and his name was Edmund Winston Pettus. Edmund Pettus, the bridge in Selma. Okay? When he left Tuscumbia, he practiced law here for a while, went to Selma, and relocated in Selma and practiced law there. So they got him to come and defend Tom Steele. And you think, how in the world do you defend somebody under that fact situation? Well, he did pretty well because they had a hung jury. They could not reach a verdict. So a mistrial was declared, and I think maybe another year went by, and the prosecutors at that time decided to try the case again. So they went back and retried it, tried it all over again. Edmund Pettis came up here, represented Tom Steele again. And guess what happened this time? Acquittal. He didn't just get a hung jury, he got an acquittal. And I said, that guy must have been one heck of a, you think of the old Southern lawyer, the orator, you know. I said, he must have been something to be able to get an acquittal in a case like that. And Tom Steele lived to be an old man. I mean, I have a good friend whose dad, when he was a boy, and some of his friends were down here in downtown Tuscumbia, and they were kind of making fun of or laughing at. There was an old man sitting on the bench, and they didn't know who he was, and they were just kind of, you know, ha-ha, look at him. And somebody heard him and said, you better not be laughing at that old man. I said, that's Tom Steele. And they said, sure enough, they got to where there was a certain angle where they could look. He had a coat on. And they got to where they could see kind of under his coat. He was wearing a gun. As an old man, you know. So they always said the Steeles were hot-blooded Irishmen. So apparently they were. But anyway, that's a story that a lot of people don't know about. There's never been a lot talked about it for obvious reasons. It's not something your town's going to be proud of that happened, especially when it was the upper echelon of society that was involved.